Hello, I'm Roaster Music, and you're watching Obsessive Compulsive Dynamics, the vlog where limitations are an invitation to be limitless. And today we're discussing the 3 boundaries every creative needs in their community if they don't want to lose their mind. So this actually works off of a hierarchical structure of concentric circles with the creators at the center, followed by the collaborators, followed by the contributors, and then outside of all of this is the community. And so those lines between the concentric circles, those are the boundaries we're going to be discussing, specifically how each of those boundaries relates to what the creator is doing at the central focal point of the creative process. So first up, we have the boundary between the creator and collaborator. The creator, we know this is their baby. They have put so much blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. It is all theirs. They get the final say. They are turning to a collaborator as a sort of glorified sounding board. Maybe the collaborator is making input. Maybe the collaborator is completing some tasks, much like a contributor does, as we'll get to in the next slide. But on the whole, the collaborator is there for the creator to discuss what's going on in some capacity with someone who understands what they're trying to achieve with the project and can provide input that is aligned with what the creator is trying to achieve. And so it really requires a lot of trust and a lot of spot-on communication for someone to be in the role of collaborator and to do that role justice for the creator and for the creator's process. Next up is the boundary between creator and contributor. In this situation, it's very task-oriented. You want, as the creator, something very specific from the contributor, and you don't want anything more and you don't want anything less. If there's any wiggle room, you let them know what that wiggle room is. Communication is key here. Sometimes you have to be able to take the task that they've done and just kind of shut out everything else that they're saying, because there will be those times that you've asked someone to be in a contributor role, get a task done, and then they think that their wiggle room includes collaborator level input, and then they're throwing their opinions, their ideas on things, trying to influence how you're going to do it, and it can be stressful. But knowing that there's a boundaries, like you asked for a specific task, they did the task or they didn't do the task, they're basically what you want the contributor to say to you is, you're welcome or I'm sorry. You're welcome for having completed the task to your specifications, or I'm sorry, I couldn't get it done. Let me know if there's something I can do to fix it. Otherwise, I'll back off and let you do whatever you need to do to handle it. Sorry. That's what you want from a contributor. Contributors don't always give that because we're human. We make errors. We want to do more, but when that is unwelcome, we are actually, as we're trying to jump line into the collaborator circle, we're actually getting having a parachute on our backs, getting caught in the wind and pulling us back outside all the circles to the critics arena. So that brings us to the boundary between creator and critics, where the creator makes this thing. They do the work, they put in the time, they put in the effort, and there is a result of some kind. And the critic says, no, I take this piece, and could you do something else with it? Did it have to be this way? Can we change this? Oh, I'm really nervous about what's going to come next to this project based on how you did this way. And I say this with comically as if making fun of the critic, because the critic is on the outside of all the boundaries. But in the example I'm going to give you, I'm actually the critic, and that example is the Criminal Minds season 14 finale. And in this example, the creator circle is inhabited by the writers of that finale, the people who came up with the idea for what was going to happen. The collaborator circle is filled with the actors, the production team, everybody helping to execute the making of the episode. And for the contributors, you have the viewers. And how it is that they are contributing, we'll get to specifically on their slide. And as the critics, me, I'll tell you where my brain went just breaking apart the episode and wishing things had been different, accepting things aren't, but wishing they had been. We'll get to that. First up, the writers and the actors. So the writers had this idea that JJ would confess a secret love for Spencer Reed. Jennifer Giroux and Spencer Reed have been like best friends for the whole of the show. And so the production team was immediately wary of this, as we have heard in interviews since the episode aired. And they didn't quite want it, and they discussed it with the actors, and they looked at the breadcrumb trail that the writers were leaving throughout season 14 to lead up to that episode. And, they got input from the people involved, primarily the actors, in terms of setting the stage for everything. And everybody agreed to be on board, and everybody did a very good job laying out the breadcrumbs, leading us into the finale. And the finale episode itself was very well constructed overall. My criticism is actually going to only come down to 2 lines of dialogue, but we will get to that. Now, the boundary with writers and viewers, we know that the viewers are in the contributor circle because in the promos, we were promised by the people who wrote the episode that we were going to hear a shocking secret as a result of a dangerous game of truth or dare. And this shocking secret ideologically divided viewers in terms of what they guessed would be the shocking secret. There are people who have been shipping Spencer and JJ for years and really wanted it to be a confession of love. And then you had people watching, it's like, wait, no, they're like brother and sister. I don't want a confession of love. And then you have people who, are giving the argument that when you work that closely with someone for years, and this is a valid argument, you develop feelings for people. Where you spend the bulk of your time is where you're probably going to meet your future spouse. Like, look at where you spend the bulk of your time. Just, I don't know where that sentence was going. But the point is, like, people, there's a reason we hear so many stories about people's childhood sweethearts, high school sweethearts, college sweethearts, meeting at the water cooler, or always saw her in the building, but she was working in a different office. Like, we hear all these stories because it's seeing a person again and again and having the opportunity of your paths regularly crossing that allows these relationships, these very integral relationships, to develop. So viewers were pretty much guessing what the secret was going to be, but everybody was divided on how they felt about that secret. And the consensus generally was that as long as it's executed well, we'll be fine with it. And I'm one of the people who's still actually on the fence about how I feel about the confession, because here we are, writers and me, the writers and everybody else in charge of the production, the actors, the directors, everybody, they make the episode, I watch the episode, and I take issue with the execution. I do. I'm in the critics area. I was supposed to be in the contributors area because for that secret to be shocking, that required the viewers to be people who were familiar with the team, familiar with the history, familiar with everything going on the show. And I've been watching the show since Tim Curry guest starred on the show, at which point I immediately started binging every episode I could get my hands on in order to get all caught up before the second piece of that 2-parter aired. And I've just been watching every episode since. There was a brief hiatus where I didn't watch for reasons that may or may not get discussed in a future episode. But when I came back to watching the show, I went back and I watched the episodes that I had missed just to catch up on some character development that had been going on in terms of new team members who I didn't know them well, and I wanted to get to know them because that's what you do. You get to know people. But here's where I take issue with the execution. It comes down to 2 lines of dialogue. Because the shock of this episode requires that you are familiar with the history of these 2 people's relationship and friendship, because the intensity of the shock is going to be proportionate to how invested you have been in the history of the show overall, they made a really tragic misstep in having the unsub call Spencer pretty boy. The number of memes that have gone around on Instagram of people saying only Morgan calls Spencer pretty boy is ridiculous. It's something that literally the only person who ever used those words together ever was Morgan in the history of this show. And to suddenly have this one-off character effectively plagiarizing him in a very serious moment and using specifically this phrase that was always used in a happy-go-lucky, familial teasing kind of way, completely undercut the seriousness of the scene. And here's the thing, as a writer, always, always, you should be striving for suspension of disbelief. When a viewer or a reader identifies with the character you have created, it's much easier for them to fall into that suspension of disbelief, but it's also still a very delicate balance maintaining that suspension of disbelief. And to plagiarize a long-standing, well-loved character with this one-off who is giving Spencer the brush off when he mentions having also been in prison, it just undercut the scene. Suddenly you're taken out of it, and it takes you a minute, or it took me a minute, to recalibrate and try to get back into the episode. But before I could, we were already upon JJ's confession. And here's the thing with that confession. Oh, please let no one be seriously hurt. JJ's confession does make sense in the moment given that her life is being threatened. It completely tracks with her own character's history, having received a similar confession, or at least a similar outpouring, from her sister before her sister tried to kill herself. Outpourings of love when somebody knows they're about to die is a very common thing, and it's something that's from her own history, so it totally made sense for her character in her final moments. If this is going to be the last thing she says, it needed to be about love. It just needed to be that. Get that. What didn't quite work is the phrasing that they gave her, which was that she always loved Spencer, and then things were complicated. Always loved, then were complicated. That doesn't track with the storyline. That doesn't track with their history. The idea that having spent so much time together, that the feelings would sneak up on her over time, 100% totally makes sense. And you can actually see it in the way that the relationship of their characters develop over the years, and even especially maybe coming to the realization during this past season or 2 in particular. But to say that she's always loved Spencer doesn't actually track. First of all, you have the number of people who have shared on Instagram the image, a side-by-side comparison image of how JJ used to look at Spencer every time he went off in his Genius Boy rants, and how she looks at him today when he goes off on a Genius Boy rant. Like, just the annoyance and the what what the hell look on her face too. Oh my God, Spencer, you're adorkable, and this is why we're family. This is why I love you kind of a look. This is why you're the godfather of my son look. So that's issue number one, why always doesn't make sense. Issue number two, always doesn't make sense, and also that then things were complicated doesn't make sense, is that it's not so much that it doesn't make sense as it's a cop-out. For her to say, I've always loved you, and then things were complicated, is akin to saying if something was going to happen between us, it would have happened already. Things happen between people because people take action. Spencer asked JJ out on a relationship very early in the series. As we found out in the 300th episode, she misunderstood that it was a date, misunderstood and didn't realize that it was a date, and invited Garcia along as a sort of outing of the young agents together, and they became three compatriots after that. And she did realize in a conversation with Spencer that that had actually been intended as a date, and that he forgave her for it not going anywhere, for it going the way that it did. And so the invitation was there. The action on his part was there. The action was not there on her part. The idea of if something was going to happen, it would have happened already, really means you did a thing to make things happen and I didn't. And I don't want to take ownership for that and hurt your feelings. That's what it's a cop-out for. It's just a cop-out from having to take ownership of your feelings. And there is further evidence that if we stay true to the language, that the language used, that that's a cop-out because of her starting her relationship with Will the way that she did. In the episode where she basically comes out as having had this long-term long-distance relationship with Will, she's struggling to do it because of the distance thing, because of the obstacles. She wants it, but she doesn't know how much she wants it. Whereas Spencer is somebody she sees every day. They live in the same city. They spend significant amounts of time together. There are no obstacles for their being together except just double checking with HR that everything's copacetic. There are no actual obstacles. What would be dealt with in this situation if it had been a choice between these two individuals is a difference between technical readiness and sacred readiness. Technical readiness, every factor is there to make the goings as easy as possible. You just have to want it, and it'll just fall into place. Easy peasy. And then sacred readiness, it doesn't matter what the obstacles are. You want something so badly, you will figure out what to do regardless of the obstacles. And she had sacred readiness for Will. Technically, she had technical readiness for Spencer, but there was no evidence of her having feelings for Spencer, which is why nothing happened. To say if something was going to happen, it would have happened already is 100% a cop-out. I swear to God, if somebody uses that language in the first 2 hours of season 15, the if something was going to happen language, I'm going to break something. I should probably line something up that I don't value too much to be broken, or at the very least, easily fixed. So that if that occurs, I don't destroy anything meaningful to me. But that is a risk. That is one of the reasons I am nervous. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter that I have these criticisms. These 2 lines of dialogue that take me out of the scene and completely, it just kind of drops the ball. Everything else around that scene, before it and after it, is perfect. It's those 2 lines of dialogue that first take you out of the moment and then let me be honest with you. Let me be very honest with you. I identify with Spencer. I, as a person with OCD, identify with Spencer. Lots of people do, because his behaviors are very much on the spectrum of autism or OCD. They never specify a mental health condition except the conditions that his mother has. And he deals very directly with addiction over the course of the show, but he himself is never revealed to have a specific diagnosis of any kind on the show, which leaves him open to lots of people identifying with him. And the thing is, when you identify with a character, their struggles, you really feel them and you really want them to do well. And anytime they triumph over a struggle, it feels like hope. It gives you hope. And here's the thing with most characters who have OCD or autism, they are often the butts of the joke, inspiration porn for people who don't live with mental illness, or tragedy porn, again, for people who don't live with mental illness. All the three of these roles are basically for the benefit of people who don't have a mental illness. People with mental illness identifying with this character see them as a representative. They see them as, we see him as symbolic of what is possible in our own lives. We struggle with the real world every day, and he's able to succeed the way that he has, and it gives us hope that we'll be able to too. And the reason that the whole undercutting and copping out feels so off is because from time to time over the course of this show, Spencer has dipped into the territory of being tragedy porn, which is when somebody who doesn't have the issues that the person in the tragedy has, in this case, mental illness, looks at that character and says, you know, my life sucks, but at least it's not as bad as that. Where they, like, tragedy porn makes you feel better about your own life. It's like when people watch the show Hoarders to feel better about their own physical mess in their homes. That's tragedy porn. That's what that is. And he and his storyline have dipped into that mode from time to time over the years. And that's very nerve-wracking. And the thing is, again, for the shock of her secret to land, they could not reveal that they were going to spend until after the show aired, until after the episode aired, they could not share that they were going to spend the first 2 hours of season 15 in terms of personal storyline, unpacking that confession and resolving that issue. Nor could they reveal that at some point in season 15, a new love interest was going to be introduced for Spencer. They could not do those things because it would have taken away from the shock. It would have spoiled the surprise of the episode. But not having that information and seeing that scene with a psycholinguistic cop-out, as someone with mental illness, I'm looking at my representative on TV and I'm thinking the writers have written him off. They have written off any chance that he will be happy, because in this moment he has dipped once again into the mode of tragedy porn. And in the past, when he's been tragedy porn, it's taken entire seasons to get him out of it. And if you're going, oh God. Here's the thing. The 3 boundaries every creative needs in their community, if they don't want to lose their mind, we as consumers of writers and creators need those boundaries too. I as a writer have to really stare down these lines when I ask for input from anybody in terms of editing, proofreading, or just giving me some feedback on my online presence or something so that I can make the adjustments that I need to make and weed out any other commentary that they're giving. Or when I post something online and people are telling me how they want me to do work, particularly with the ASMR videos that I have done, and people saying, oh, you should do whisper videos. And I will never do whisper videos because the sound of whispering for me synesthetically feels like people shoving needles in my ears. I will never do it. Stop asking me. Kind of I need to just weed it out. Let it go. They're on the outside of the circles. They do not understand. It's fine. But I, as a consumer of content, also have to be respectful of these boundaries. It's the community as a whole where these boundaries reside. And being aware of these boundaries helps me as a viewer to remember, you know what? It's called Criminal Minds. It's called Criminal Minds. They do make a point again and again that mental illness isn't what makes someone a criminal. It's ideology. It's what a person believes. It's the chain of logic they follow, which can be exacerbated by mental illness. But again, it is the ideology. It is the beliefs. It is an individual's personal logic that leads to them being a criminal, not whether or not they have a mental illness. They're very good about that. But they're not very good about non-criminals with mental illness leading happy, productive lives. Most shows aren't. And to finally have a representative on TV who feels more like me than any other fictitious representative I've seen, who even wants in their personal life the same things I want, to be happy and sane and married and have a family. These are things that I want. These are things that Spencer wants. And so to see this cop-out language as though he's just been dropped again, he's just had his heart broken again without the context of what was coming, that was very disconcerting, and it very much felt like I was getting shoved out of the contributor circle into the wasteland of being a critic. Because the thing about him dipping into tragedy porn is that he is then ultimately being created and manipulated for the entertainment of people who don't have a mental illness. And that's going to be a very difficult thing, in my opinion, for them to write themselves out of. And they got 10 episodes left. The first 2 hours of all of which is pretty much going to be focused on JJ. Coming out of her confession with Spencer and how that affects their relationship, coming out of that confession and it's like the complications, as they refer to them, and dealing with her marriage, which she does love and want and need. And then you have 8 episodes, 8 hours left. 1 hour per remaining character leaves an additional hour, hopefully, for Spencer, specifically for a proper introduction of his new love interest, in order to really set the foundation for her being there and being in his life and being the logical partner he needs, who helps to get him out of his head and out of where he spirals into through work. Work got him out of addiction, but now what's getting him out of work, essentially? And they just haven't been great at respecting characters with mental health in the past, most notably Spencer's mother. When they first introduced her, Spencer brings her a book by her favorite author, and she says that it is the author's lesser work. And none of that worked, because here's the thing, if you understand anything about medieval literature, Marjorie Kemp, the favorite writer that they gave her, wasn't actually a writer because she was illiterate. And in order to be a writer, you need to be able to write. That's issue number one. Issue number two is that the reason they picked her as the favorite writer is because her nickname was the Mad Woman of God. Issue number three was that he's bringing a first edition of this book to his mother. So apparently it's a 400-year-old book that he's bringing her, which is completely illogical given that she's living in an assisted living facility and forgets to feed herself if she's not properly medicated. And she calls it Marjorie Kemp's lesser work, which is not possible because the book is literally called The Book of Marjorie Kemp, Mad Woman of God. This writer, this book were chosen to emphasize the fact that Spencer's mother is living with mental illness. It was in no way actually respectful of the years of work that we know of intrinsically about her backstory that she put into becoming a professor of medieval literature. Like that's just, it is beyond rude, if I'm being honest, to have done that to Spencer's mother. And little things like that getting peppered in over the years, they just got me real nervous. And I am very much invested in what happens next with Spencer, because his struggles and his coming out of them have given me hope. I really want to believe that it'll turn out okay, but I just can't be sure. And going into season 15 and watching every single episode of it, I'm going to be looking real hard at this chart here. I'm going to be staring down those lines and remembering that I'm on the line between contributor and critic. I am a person who has been watching for a long time, who is very invested in what goes down for all these characters, particularly Spencer, because I feel like he is my televised representation. And yet I know that every little slip is them not writing his character for people who feel represented by Spencer. It's for people who view him as tragedy porn or inspiration porn, not as representation. And a show that has been so empathetic towards people who are continuously othered, however inadvertent it may be, engaging in othering their own audience. It's tough. It's tough facing that as a possibility as this show that I have really, really enjoyed draws to a close. And it's a really important thing to consider with my own writing. It's a really important thing to consider with your own writing, that when you have a character who's exhibiting behaviors that you're not living with, there's a lot of pressure on you, however much you do or don't acknowledge it, however much we do or do not acknowledge it, to be respectful of those perspectives and to do right by them. Because whether we mean to or not, we're revealing something about how we view the world in the stories that we tell. And that is why it is so very, very important to think about boundaries like this. Because the more we can improve the stories we tell ourselves, We can improve the stories that we're telling each other. And then from there, improve the stories we're telling together as a family, community, collective, society, whatever. And that's what it's going to take, little by little, day by day, to build a better world through better storytelling. And I believe it's possible. It's just starts and stops, two steps forward, one step back. Really, the little by little feels like loss after loss, but there is some progress being made. Just acknowledging when we come across a stumble, we can do a little bit better. And they're never going to see this. They're already in production of the final season as this is being recorded. It's not about swaying anybody to correct what's going on that particular show right now. It's about considering this is how a very long-standing show handled something really important. And there's a learning opportunity for us here in these boundaries and how they affect stories we tell ourselves, stories we tell each other, and the stories we tell together. Thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Later, neighbors.